So the other topic I wanted to introduce you to in this area of social neuroscience is learning a little bit more about self-regulation, because there was a lot of research in the last 10 years or so about self-regulation, and it falls into the realm of social neuroscience because we also look at the biology of the body as we make decisions and how things like glucose levels can have an impact on our decision making. So we think of self-regulation as our ability to override initial automatic responses. We also can think of it as self-control, or our ability to delay gratification. I've linked you to a fun video about marshmallows, which studies a classic form of self-regulation studied by Walter Mischel to see if young children could delay eating a marshmallow in order to get another marshmallow later. And the children who were better able to do that ended up being far more successful later in college. Now, the video I'm going to show you is just a replication of that particular study, but it's cute as heck. You can also think of it as what happens when we suppress negative thoughts. So for example, if you're told, watch this movie but don't display how uncomfortable you are on your face, then that involves self-regulation, especially if it's a very uncomfortable movie. If you're putting forth effort on an unlikable task, that takes effort. That involves self-regulation. Smiling to be polite is another example of self-regulation. It's an effortful task that takes energy and that doesn't necessarily reflect what you might think and feel, so it takes that additional extra effort. Things like staying committed to a relationship or choosing a healthier food option all involve intentional choice and effortful activity. Self-regulation is at work with those things too. So hopefully you have a little bit of a better idea of what self-regulation is. This notion of our ability to wait, our ability to think in the long term, to think through the consequences, and to override our initial automatic responses. We can think of self-regulation as a resource, and that resource is finite. What that means is that if you use it, you can use it up, and you can expend all your self-regulation. So for example, they asked people in the study by Muravan to regulate their emotions during a distressing clip or not. So here's this disgusting clip from a film. Don't display emotions on your face, or just watch this film and react as you usually would. And then people were asked to squeeze an exercise hand grip task for as long as they could. So this is like a hand grip, like an exercise task where you have to squeeze it, and they were asked to hold it in a certain position for as long as they could. And what they found is that people who were asked to not display their emotions on their face squeezed the hand grip for less time than people who were not asked to regulate their emotions, indicating that they had expended energy in the previous task and they were running out of that energy in the second task. Here's another example from a study that was done with cookies versus radishes. And the cookies were warm and freshly baked and smelled delightful. Basically, they brought people into a study that had plates of food, one plate of cookies and one plate of radishes, and participants were told to either eat the radishes or eat the cookies. And then they were given an unsolvable task. And this unsolvable task is a way to measure effort independent of puzzle solving ability. So you see how long people work at this unsolvable puzzle before they give up. If the puzzle was solvable, then somebody might look at it and solve it right away, and we wouldn't be able to measure their effort or their persistence. The radishes group gave up far sooner than the cookies group, so expending that energy to eat the healthy food ended up making them less likely to be effortful on a subsequent task. So one way of thinking of self-regulation is that it's like a muscle that requires energy and that you can deplete that energy. This is one of the reasons why you might get tired or hungry after doing something that's effortful mentally that you haven't necessarily moved your body for. So for example, driving long distances or working on a paper can often leave you feeling tired and hungry even if you haven't been moving. And once again, if you use up that energy on tasks, then you're less able to self-regulate on subsequent tasks. Now, what we know is that even though our self-regulatory reserves are finite, that we often engage in what's known as conservation. So we don't necessarily completely deplete our self-regulatory capacity. We tend to go into conservation mode or energy saving mode, if you want to think about it that way. So for example, when people do task 1 where they have to regulate, and then task 2 where they also have to regulate, they usually do worse on task 2 than they do on task 1. But if they have a very high incentive to self-regulate for task 2, then they continue to perform at a high level, indicating that they've pulled on those reserves rather than conserving their energy. It's interesting to note that some people are much better at self-regulation than others. They're more disciplined, they don't eat the unhealthy things, they get up at the same time every day, they practice a great deal of self-discipline. Some people are just better at it than others. It's actually a personality trait you can measure. And it's interesting to note that people who are better at self-regulation are not necessarily holding some sort of deeper reserves, they're just better at conservation. So for example, they don't go down the cookie aisle to begin with. They don't put themselves in a position where they have to make a lot of important decisions. They limit their decision making. So people who are better at self-regulation are better at conservation. And once again, self-regulation can be thought of as related to decision making. Making a decision makes people less capable to regulate on subsequent tasks. Delayed gratification, or holding off reward until later, thinking through long-term plans and consequences. Delayed gratification is a form of self-regulation. So when you take a look at that marshmallow task of those cute kids, they're engaging in a form of regulatory capacity. And our ability to delay gratification can be reduced if self-regulation is depleted. So one of the things that we've explored is the connection between self-regulation and glucose levels, which is what brings us into the realm of social neuroscience. So glucose is a form of cell energy. You can think of it in very simple terms as our sugar, our blood sugar, or carbohydrate levels. And what we found is that the glucose levels in our system are reduced after we engage in self-regulation tasks, indicating that making those effortful decisions is actually expending cell energy or using up our blood sugar. One of the things we've studied is that people who come into a research experiment after fasting, so they haven't eaten for 12 hours, for example, they are less capable of self-regulating effectively. And so that has some interesting implications. For example, people who are dealing with diabetes often have trouble maintaining a steady level of their blood sugar. And they can experience sudden plummets in their blood sugar if it's not adequately maintained. And so you can see how that might lead to some challenges when it comes to being good about diet and careful about monitoring blood sugar levels, because decision making and thinking through consequences of things are severely impacted when you don't have the capacity to self-regulate due to lowered glucose levels. I also want to think a little bit more about those kids with the marshmallows. If you'll remember, one of the things that I talked about earlier was that in Walter Mischel's study about this marshmallow task, the kids who were able to wait eating on the marshmallow for the bigger marshmallow reward later tended to do better in college. But keep in mind that one of the factors that can impact kids' ability to self-regulate involves whether they had breakfast that day. And regular access to good nutrition tends to help with decision making. Also, kids who are in a more unstable environment at home might not necessarily trust that the marshmallow is going to be there later as a reward. So they might think it's more better to have the reward that they have in front of them that's guaranteed instead of waiting for a bigger reward later. So this can often intersect with socioeconomic status, because people in low socioeconomic status conditions often have food insecurity, and they might also, once again, have an unstable environment that might not lend itself to long-term planning. So if you take a look at kids and their ability to self-regulate, kids in lower socioeconomic status conditions have less capacity to self-regulate than kids who are from wealthier families. And this can have long-term effects on their ability to be effective when it comes to performance in a school setting.